A pregnant woman collapses in the middle of her own divorce hearing. The air is sucked out of the oak-paneled courtroom, gasps echo as the judge slams his gavel for order. But her husband, the millionaire she built her life with, doesn't move a muscle. Cold. Unbothered. His beautiful younger mistress only smirks from the gallery, her lips curling into a smile of smug victory. They think they've won. They think they've finally broken her, moments away from stripping her of everything she owns. But what they don't know is that the judge holds a single sealed envelope. Inside it, a DNA test that won't just reveal the father of the unborn child. It will detonate secrets, shatter alliances, and expose a betrayal so twisted it could destroy everything they thought they controlled. Stay with me until the very end, because this isn't just a story, it's a storm of lies, revenge, and shocking revelations that you won't see coming. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because this is about to get intense. It all began in the silent tension of the courtroom, a room where polished wood, cold marble, and heavy chandeliers bore witness to the slow unraveling of a marriage that once promised forever. The smell of waxed floors and old law books clung to the air, but it was the energy, the unspoken war between power and betrayal, that electrified the space. On one side sat the millionaire, sleek in a custom-tailored navy suit, jawline sharp as his arrogance. His mistress, young, beautiful, draped in red like a queen awaiting her coronation, leaned back in the gallery, every gesture oozing smug confidence. And then there was the wife, the heavily pregnant woman whose body carried both the weight of new life and the crushing burden of betrayal, gripping the armrest of her chair as though it were her only anchor. The moment the judge began reading the opening lines of the divorce filings, the dam broke. Her chest heaved, her vision blurred, and she crumpled. Gasps rippled through the room as her body collapsed onto the polished courtroom floor, hands instinctively reaching to cradle her swollen belly even as consciousness slipped from her grasp. Lawyers scattered, clerks rushed forward, and the bailiff barked orders, but one man remained frozen, her husband. His face was a mask of indifference, eyes void of empathy, lips pressed into a line that revealed nothing. By his side, his mistress smirked, almost amused, her eyes gleaming as though this collapse were a performance she had scripted herself. When they revived the pregnant woman minutes later, her lashes fluttered open to the harsh courtroom lights, her breath shaky, her heartbeat unsteady but alive. The gavel struck again, demanding silence as she was helped back to her seat. The courtroom settled, but the energy had shifted, charged now with something deeper, darker, a storm waiting to break. The judge cleared his throat, holding up the envelope, the one no one seemed to pay attention to in the chaos. It was sealed, unassuming, yet its contents had the power to rip through everything that smug smirk and cold arrogance thought they had secured. The millionaire sat upright, exuding a false confidence, convinced this was all theatrics, another weak attempt to delay the inevitable. To him, this woman was nothing more than an obstacle to be swept aside. He had spent years crafting an empire, but in the shadows of that empire lay truths he had never imagined would crawl into the light. For years he believed he was untouchable, that money, charm, and calculated ruthlessness would protect him. But what he failed to see was the silent war his wife had been fighting long before they stepped foot into that courtroom. The cracks had begun months earlier, one quiet night in their Los Angeles mansion. His mistress thought she was clever, slipping into his bed when the wife was supposed to be away, whispering promises and venom in the same breath. But the wife was not asleep in her room. She was wide awake, her world shattering as she overheard the conversation. She listened as the man she had given her youth, her loyalty, and her body to whispered that he was tired of her. That once the divorce was finalized, once the papers were stamped, he would chase her out of his empire, take the child from her, and start a new dynasty with the woman who lay draped across his chest. The words sliced deeper than any blade, but instead of breaking her, they lit a fire in her chest. A fire of revenge, of silent preparation, of strategy. Unknown to him, her father had been the true backbone of the company, the shadow investor whose assets propped up every skyscraper, every factory, every contract the millionaire flaunted as his own. Her father, a shrewd businessman, had placed everything under careful trusts, and when his health declined, he quietly granted his daughter access. The millionaire never knew. He thought his empire was untouchable because it bore his name, but the reality was brutal. The real power sat in accounts tied to her bloodline, not his arrogance. And that night, after the sting of betrayal nearly crushed her spirit, she made a choice. She transferred everything, all of her father's shares and holdings, silently and legally, to her own name. She built an invisible wall of ownership that would one day close in on the man who thought he owned her. The pregnancy itself was another twist of fate she orchestrated with defiance. She had been broken-hearted, hollowed out by his betrayal, but not defeated. One night, away from the suffocating mansion, she allowed herself one moment of reckless freedom with a stranger, a man whose name she would never reveal. That night was her rebellion, her declaration that she would never again allow her life to be dictated by his betrayal. When she discovered she was pregnant, she didn't collapse under the weight of shame or fear. Instead, she turned her swollen belly into her shield and her sword. Now in that courtroom, the millionaire thought her collapse was weakness, thought her fainting was proof of defeat. But what he didn't know was that every step had been calculated. Every move had been planned. And the pregnancy he mocked, the belly he once threatened to use as leverage, carried not just life but the symbol of his undoing. The mistress leaned forward, eyes glinting with triumph, certain the final reading of the divorce papers would strip the wife of everything. She imagined herself stepping into luxury, into power, into the life she thought she deserved. But the judge adjusted his glasses, his hand tightening on the envelope, the weight of justice pressing against the thin paper seal. The air in the courtroom was heavy, as though the walls themselves were leaning closer to hear the words about to be spoken. This wasn't just another divorce. It was a reckoning. A story years in the making, a slow burn of betrayal, power, greed, and secrets about to explode in a single revelation. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on the pregnant woman. She sat upright now, no longer trembling, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. She was no longer the broken wife clinging to the remnants of a marriage. She was the architect of his downfall, the silent storm waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The millionaire shifted uncomfortably, a flicker of doubt crossing his face for the first time. The mistress adjusted her dress, her smirk faltering ever so slightly as the weight of anticipation pressed down on her. The envelope glared from the judge's hand like a prophecy. It contained not only the DNA test but the truth of everything they had overlooked. And as the pregnant woman exhaled slowly, her hands resting protectively on her belly, the courtroom seemed to pulse with energy, as if destiny itself had taken a seat among the rows of spectators. The fainting spell was not the end. It was only the beginning. The beginning of a war that would not just redefine love and betrayal, but expose how arrogance blinds the powerful, and how vengeance, when planned in silence, can topple empires. The millionaire thought this was the day he won, but it was the day his empire began to collapse under the weight of secrets too heavy to hide. The gavel struck the bench, its sharp crack bouncing off the oak-paneled walls, pulling the courtroom back into uneasy silence. Every eye flickered between the judge's firm hand holding that sealed envelope and the pregnant woman who had only moments earlier collapsed under the weight of betrayal and exhaustion. Her fainting spell was interpreted by many as weakness, a final act of surrender. But as she sat straighter now, eyes focused, hands resting protectively on her stomach, something about her presence shifted. She wasn't fragile. She was coiled, like a lioness recovering after a stumble, waiting for the exact second to unleash the truth that would destroy everything the man beside her thought he had secured. The millionaire leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming impatiently on the polished wooden table. He was certain victory was already his. To him, the divorce was not about justice or fairness. It was about domination, about cutting ties with what he considered dead weight. His suit gleamed under the fluorescent lights, his hair slicked back with precision, his posture exuding the smug arrogance of a man convinced of his own invincibility. At his side, his mistress in a crimson dress traced her manicured nails along the railing, lips curved into a smile so sharp it might have cut glass. She whispered something under her breath, a private celebration, as if the courtroom had already pronounced the wife defeated. But across the aisle, the wife knew the truth. This was not the end. This was the beginning. Every second that passed was another step toward the revelation she had crafted with the precision of a strategist. Long before the courtroom battle began, long before her fainting spell drew gasps of pity and disdain, she had already secured her place in the shadows of power. It had started quietly, in the dead of night, when secrets reveal themselves most loudly. Her discovery of her husband's affair had not been through suspicion or instinct, but through raw, devastating proof. She had returned from a visit with her mother one night earlier than expected, her footsteps light on the marble staircase of their Los Angeles mansion. The doors were half open, the lights dimmed, but the whispers were unmistakable. Her husband's voice carried through the air, heavy with venom and betrayal. He was sprawled across silk sheets, his mistress curled beside him like a trophy, and his words burned her ears. He spoke of discarding her, of chasing her out once the divorce was finalized, of how her pregnancy meant nothing, because his future belonged to the younger woman. The betrayal cut deeper than a blade, but what he did not know was that those words planted the seed of his undoing. She did not storm in. She did not cry or fight. Instead, she slipped away into the night, carrying with her the knowledge that her marriage was over and her revenge had just begun. She knew something he didn't. The foundation of his empire was not built on his brilliance alone. Her father, a man of sharp wit and calculated generosity, had always been the silent force propping up the empire her husband flaunted as his own. Her father's investments, his hidden shares, his discreet network of connections, these were the true bones of the company. The millionaire believed he was the master of his fortune, but in truth, he was a king propped up by a throne built by another man's hands. And that throne was hers to inherit. While her husband slept beside his mistress, drunk on arrogance and betrayal, she spent her nights poring over documents, hidden contracts, and ironclad trusts. Her father, weakened by age and illness, had quietly placed much of his power into her name, a move designed to protect her should the marriage ever turn hostile. And now, with the bitter clarity of betrayal lighting her path, she moved with precision. One by one, she transferred assets, securing ownership, locking down influence, shifting wealth into her control like a silent storm that no one saw coming. By the time the divorce was filed, the empire was already hers. But she wasn't finished. Betrayal demanded more than silent control. It demanded a reckoning that would be felt in every corner of his carefully crafted life. And so, she crafted her next move, the pregnancy. Her belly, round with new life, had become both her shield and her weapon. She carried it with pride, but she also carried the truth that it was not her husband's child. One night, in the heat of heartbreak and determination, she allowed herself to step away from the cage he had built around her. A stranger, faceless in the larger story but pivotal in her journey, gave her what she needed, a child that was hers alone. Not his legacy. Not his bloodline. A living reminder that her future would not be chained to the man who betrayed her. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the judge adjusted his glasses, ready to break the seal on the envelope. The millionaire smirked, thinking the DNA test would humiliate her further, expose her as unfaithful, and secure his position as the victor. He leaned forward, eager to hear the verdict, already imagining the smirk of his mistress widening as the courtroom gasped at the revelation of infidelity. But what he didn't realize was that this too was part of her plan. She had wanted the test. She had allowed it. She had planted the seed of suspicion herself, ensuring that the test would be ordered, ensuring that it would be the stage upon which the truth was finally revealed. Because this was not about proving who fathered the child. This was about proving who truly held the power. The courtroom was silent except for the shuffle of papers. The judge's voice, steady and deliberate, filled the air. The words weren't read yet, but the energy was suffocating. The millionaire's mistress leaned forward, eyes glinting with cruel delight. The millionaire adjusted his cufflinks, a predator ready to pounce. But the wife simply sat there, serene, her belly rising and falling with calm breaths, her eyes steady on the man who thought he had destroyed her. She knew what was coming. The judge's hand tore the seal. The paper slid out, crisp and damning. His eyes scanned the first line, and for the briefest second, something flickered across his face. Shock. The kind of shock that tightened his jaw, that furrowed his brow, that silenced even the scratch of pens across legal pads. And then he began to read. What followed was not the story the millionaire expected. It was the story his wife had written long before they stepped into the courtroom. It was the unveiling of betrayal, not hers, but his. It was the revelation that the empire he thought untouchable was now crumbling under the weight of truths he had refused to see. The mistress's smirk faltered, her fingers curling tightly around the railing. The millionaire's confident smirk froze, a crack splitting across the mask he had worn so well. And in that moment, as her fainting spell was forgotten, as the courtroom collectively leaned forward to hear the truth unravel, the pregnant woman finally allowed herself the faintest smile. This was not weakness. This was war. And the battlefield was only beginning to burn. The judge's voice carried through the courtroom like the slow toll of a bell, every syllable reverberating through the oak-paneled walls. The envelope had been opened, the first lines of truth spoken, and the atmosphere was no longer one of smug victory. It was anticipation, dread, the weight of an avalanche teetering on the edge of release. The millionaire, arms folded in arrogant confidence, still believed it was his moment. His mistress leaned forward in her crimson dress, her lips curled into a smile that dared anyone to question her triumph. But the woman at the center of it all, the pregnant wife they had mocked, underestimated, and dismissed, sat calm and steady, her belly rising beneath the blue fabric of her gown, her gaze locked on the man she once called her husband. The courtroom was silent enough to hear the rustle of paper as the judge continued. The DNA results were not what the millionaire expected. Not his child. The words hit the room like a hammer against glass. The mistress gasped, delighted, thinking this was the final blow that would annihilate the pregnant woman's credibility. She imagined the wife's humiliation, the whispers, the shame. But as her laughter caught in her throat, she realized the wife wasn't crying. She wasn't broken. She was smiling, a slow, deliberate smile that told the world she was still in control. The millionaire's smirk faltered. For the first time in the entire trial, doubt flickered in his eyes. His mistress shifted uncomfortably, confused by the serenity radiating from the very woman she thought was defeated. If the DNA test was supposed to destroy her, why did she look like the one who had already won? The judge cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he turned to the next set of documents in the thick folder before him. His words were measured, heavy, like a pendulum swinging toward its target. The ownership of assets, company shares, and properties were to be reviewed as part of the divorce settlement. The mistress leaned in again, eager to hear the reading that would cement their control of everything the wife was about to lose. But then came the first revelation. The primary shareholder of the company was not the millionaire. It never had been. For years, the true weight of the empire rested in the hands of the wife's father, whose investments, silent yet monumental, kept the business afloat. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom, shocked gasps filling the air. The millionaire froze, his face tightening as the judge read further. During her father's decline, those shares had been quietly transferred, not to his son-in-law as the millionaire had always believed, but to his daughter, the very woman he now sought to discard. Line after line confirmed it: the controlling stake, the majority voting power, the assets tied to subsidiaries, all of it bore her name. Not his. Not theirs. Hers. The mistress's smirk vanished. Her manicured nails gripped the railing until her knuckles whitened. She turned sharply toward the millionaire, eyes wide with panic, but his face was a mask of fury, his jaw clenched, his temple throbbing. He had strutted into this courtroom ready to watch his wife crumble, but instead he was hearing the foundations of his empire collapse beneath him. The judge continued, detailing the legal transfers, the signatures, the dates. Every paper bore the wife's name, ironclad and unchallengeable. Lawyers for the millionaire scrambled, flipping through their files, whispering frantically, but there was nothing to dispute. The paperwork was flawless. She had moved like a shadow, striking silently and surgically, and by the time he realized it, it was too late. The mistress buried her face in her hands, her confidence dissolving into trembling disbelief. She had pinned her entire future on a man who no longer had anything to give. The millionaire tried to interrupt, his voice booming with outrage, but the judge silenced him with a gavel strike, demanding order. The pregnant wife remained seated unshaken, her hands folded gently over her belly as though protecting not just her child, but the empire she had just revealed to be hers. The courtroom erupted with whispers. Spectators leaned forward, eyes wide, murmuring about the downfall of the man who once claimed to own everything. Journalists scribbled furiously, knowing headlines would explode by morning. Millionaire exposed. Wife takes it all. Mistress blindsided. Every eye flickered between the husband's red, furious face and the wife's calm, composed strength. The judge's voice cut through the chaos again, firm and unrelenting. The divorce would proceed, but the division of assets would not be what the millionaire expected. The bulk of the company, the properties, the accounts, all belonged to her. The prenuptial agreements he thought would protect him were rendered meaningless by the overwhelming legal authority of her father's trusts and her careful transfers. The millionaire slumped back in his chair, a storm raging in his chest. His mistress grabbed his arm, whispering frantically, her voice edged with panic, but he shoved her off. His empire, his pride, his future, gone in the blink of an eye. He had mocked her collapse, laughed at her tears, sneered at her pregnancy. And yet here he sat, stripped of power, staring across the aisle at the woman he had betrayed, who now held his entire world in her hands. The pregnant wife exhaled slowly, her smile faint but sharp. This was the moment she had envisioned since that night when she heard his betrayal whispered in the dark. This was why she had endured humiliation, why she had carried her secret in silence, why she had built her strength one step at a time. The DNA test that had been meant to humiliate her was irrelevant now. It was a distraction compared to the real revelation. She was no longer his wife, his possession, or his victim. She was his downfall. The mistress shifted in her seat, her eyes darting wildly as she realized what it meant. She had given everything, her reputation, her loyalty, her body, to a man who no longer had wealth, no longer had power. Her future, once wrapped in diamonds and luxury, now lay in ruins. And worse, she had to watch as the woman she scorned walked away not broken, but victorious. The judge slammed his gavel again, declaring that the final settlement would strip the millionaire of his claims. He would walk away with nothing more than his personal belongings and debts, while his former wife left the courtroom with the company, the assets, and her unborn child secure in her care. The mistress's face crumpled, a silent scream caught in her throat as the realization of defeat sank in. The millionaire's fists pounded the table, veins bulging in his neck, fury radiating off him like heat. But no amount of rage could rewrite the truth. His arrogance had blinded him. His betrayal had backfired. The woman he had mocked as weak had orchestrated a masterpiece of revenge, and now he sat powerless in the very place he thought he would celebrate his victory. The pregnant wife rose slowly, her movements graceful, her belly leading the way as if symbolizing the future she carried. The room turned to watch her, the once broken woman now radiant in triumph. She adjusted her gown, smoothed her hand over her stomach, and walked past the man who had underestimated her. For the first time, he lowered his eyes, unable to meet her gaze. The courtroom doors swung open, and she stepped out into the flashing lights of waiting cameras, the roar of reporters desperate to capture the story. Behind her, the echoes of the gavel still rang, marking not just the end of a marriage, but the beginning of a legacy that was hers alone. And deep inside that courtroom, the mistress and the millionaire sat shattered, their empire in ruins, their arrogance turned to ash. The gavel struck one final time, its echo booming through the courtroom like thunder, sealing the fate of a man who once believed he could never be touched. The millionaire sat hunched, shoulders trembling, his face twisted in disbelief. The polished confidence, the smirk that had once commanded boardrooms and intimidated rivals, was gone. What remained was a hollow shell of arrogance, stripped bare in front of the very crowd he had once flaunted his wealth to. Beside him, The mistress's mascara-streaked face mirrored the collapse of her dreams. Hours earlier, she had walked into the courthouse draped in red silk and pride. Now she shrank into herself, trembling, humiliated, powerless. The courtroom itself was still buzzing, a storm of whispers and hurried notes, as journalists scribbled furiously, cameras ready to capture the scandal of the century. They had expected a simple divorce hearing, a routine dismantling of a marriage. Instead, they had witnessed an empire collapse, the revelation of betrayal, and the rise of a woman everyone had underestimated. The pregnant wife stood, her hand resting gently over her swollen belly, her back straight, her eyes steady. She did not gloat. She did not lash out. Her silence was more powerful than any words could have been. Her victory was not in the shouting, but in the undeniable truth that the papers, the assets, and the child she carried had already secured her future. She had no need to scream. The world had already seen who she had become, the woman who outsmarted the man who thought he owned her. The judge dismissed the case, but the murmurs followed as she moved slowly down the aisle. Every head turned. Spectators leaned forward to glimpse her face, her strength, the aura of victory that radiated from her like light breaking through storm clouds. Her pregnancy, once used against her as a mark of weakness, now made her unstoppable. She carried not only life but the proof that she was untethered from her husband's chains, free to write her own story. Behind her, the millionaire tried to stand, his hand gripping the edge of the table, but his legs wobbled under the weight of his collapse. Rage poured out of him like venom. He shouted after her, words tangled with fury and desperation, but the gavel struck again, silencing him. No one listened anymore. The empire that once made his voice powerful was gone, and without it, he was just another broken man yelling into the void. The mistress turned toward him, eyes blazing with betrayal. This was not the future she had been promised. He had sworn she would be queen beside him, draped in diamonds, untouchable in wealth. Instead, she was left with nothing but shame. She hissed at him through clenched teeth, her voice cracking, her nails digging into his arm. But he pushed her away, their alliance crumbling in front of everyone. What had once been passion and arrogance turned instantly to venom and blame. Their whispers, their laughter, their plotting, it all came undone under the fluorescent lights of that courtroom. Outside, the world was waiting. The courthouse steps were lined with reporters, cameras flashing like lightning, microphones shoved forward to capture even the smallest gesture. The pregnant wife emerged, her gown flowing, her belly leading, her head held high. Gasps erupted from the crowd, not because she was weak, but because she was magnificent. Every camera angle caught her strength, every headline already forming around her triumph. Pregnant wife wins it all. Millionaire's mistress silenced. The empire was hers all along. The lights blinded her, but she did not flinch. She walked through the chaos with grace, her hand never leaving her stomach. She wasn't walking out as a victim. She was walking out as the rightful heir of the empire her father had built, as a mother who had secured her child's future, as a woman who had turned betrayal into fire. Inside, the millionaire slumped into his chair, his lawyers whispering frantically, but he no longer heard them. His mind reeled with every revelation, every asset stripped from him, every headline that would mark his name as a cautionary tale. He had believed himself untouchable, but now he was nothing more than a public failure. His empire, his reputation, his mistress, gone in one afternoon. The mistress fled before the reporters could swarm her, her once proud stride replaced by hurried steps and trembling hands. She covered her face as cameras chased her down, but it was too late. The images were already captured, her downfall already broadcast to the world. She was no longer the queen she imagined. She was the other woman whose greed left her with nothing. The wife, however, did not need to speak to the press. Her silence was its own statement. Her lawyers spoke on her behalf, confirming her legal control of the company, the assets, the properties. Every question shouted by reporters, about the DNA test, about the mistress, about the millionaire's collapse, was drowned beneath the undeniable truth: she had won. In the days that followed, the fallout spread like wildfire. The company's board members aligned themselves with her, eager to distance their names from the disgraced former figurehead. Contracts that had once been tied to her husband's arrogance were now tied to her strength. The markets shifted, headlines exploded, and the world quickly learned a lesson. The empire had always been hers, and now, she stood in the light to claim it. For the millionaire, the days turned darker. His calls went unanswered, his credit lines frozen, his name blacklisted in circles that once welcomed him. The mistress abandoned him, publicly denouncing him to salvage her own reputation, though it was already ruined. Alone, disgraced, he stared at the walls of the mansion he thought would always be his, now legally signed into the hands of the very woman he betrayed. And for the wife, freedom came like a sunrise. She moved into her new life with dignity, preparing for the arrival of her child. Her days were filled with strategy and rebuilding, not in the shadows, but openly as the rightful leader of an empire. She surrounded herself with loyal advisors, people who respected her not just for her last name, but for her resilience. The memory of her husband's betrayal no longer haunted her, it fueled her. Her pregnancy became the ultimate symbol of her victory. Every headline that once tried to frame it as weakness now celebrated it as strength. She carried life into a future she had built with her own hands, a future where her child would never know the chains she had been forced to break. The final image burned into the public's memory was that of the courtroom collapse turned triumph. A woman underestimated, humiliated, betrayed, rising from the floor with tears still on her cheeks and fire in her heart, and walking out into the world as the victor. The millionaire thought he had won. The mistress thought she had secured her place. But the truth was written in silence, in paperwork, in patience, and in strategy. The empire was never theirs. It was always hers. And as the courthouse doors closed behind her that day, the pregnant woman smiled faintly, her hand resting on her stomach. The war was over. She had won. And just like that, the man who thought he owned the world lost everything in one afternoon. The mistress who thought she had won was left with nothing but shame, and the woman they mocked, the pregnant wife they tried to break, walked away not just victorious, but powerful beyond measure. Her father's empire, her unborn child, her freedom, all hers. But here's the real question, was this victory destiny, or was it her master plan all along? Before you answer, let me remind you, this is just one of many stories where betrayal, greed, and arrogance meet their ultimate downfall. And trust me, the next one will shock you even more. So hit that subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Do you think the mistress got what she deserved? Or should the wife have gone even further with her revenge? Let's talk about it in the comments. Because this isn't the end, it's just the beginning of more jaw-dropping stories you won't believe until you hear them.